Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. The reality is that's the reputation that grammar education has, but it shouldn't be, because grammar is becoming ever more important in our society, particularly when we look at our younger generations. So much is text-based. So much is social media and posting. Grammar, at least the semblance of grammar, you would think would be even more important. So that's one reason why we need to talk about grammar. And the other reason we still need to talk about grammar is grammar doesn't have to be taught the way it was taught for eons and centuries. It can be fun, it can be engaging, and it needs to be evolving because it is a representation of our cultures. It's our representation of ourselves and the cultures in which we live. So this is why I'm really excited tonight to actually be talking grammar. And we're going to be talking grammar with the author of Not Your Granny's Grammar, a book recently written and published by Patty McGee LLC, and her co-author, Tim Donahue. Patty is a veteran teacher. She was a school librarian, an instructional coach, and a professional development facilitator in my home state of New Jersey. Patty, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your work.
Thank you for having me.
So, Patty, the first question I always like asking folks, can you just walk us through how did grammar become an area of interest for you, and why should it be an interest to other people?
Yeah, so I can start with 1996, my second year of teaching. I started on a journey of really refining my literacy instruction. And I saw so much growth in students the more I grew as a literacy educator. However, it was wonderful until I got to grammar because I did not know what to do with grammar other than the practices that were used when I was learning grammar. And so it was dry, it was boring, it wasn't being applied. I didn't know another way. It was identification, using a lot of worksheets, quite silent and solo, and a lot of memorization. And I found myself on now what's become a 30-year journey of just trying to figure out what can work in grammar instruction. Why is it so traditional? We're not seeing the transfer in most cases. The majority of teachers do not feel comfortable with their grammar knowledge. And I think that's an indicator of why these practices were not really effective except for a small few grammarians. So that's how I got really interested in grammar and trying to find better ways. But I also think it should be a priority. I know that there's so many things to fit on everyone's plate. So in a minute, we can talk about time and that sort of thing. But when we know sentences specifically, especially as a foundation for grammar instruction, creating, combining, and expanding sentences are the three best ways of teaching grammar. And when we can do that, where kids actually are learning it over time, they become stronger writers. They see grammar as style. They see grammar as something they can mold and use in different ways. Since sentences are the containers of all parts of speech and the building blocks for writing, that is the Number one place to start year.
So, if we're talking about grammar in a new chic way, but an important way, and you were mentioning some of the things that we could be doing when we're teaching grammar, such as providing sentence stems, which is a
Mhm.
great differentiation strategy for your
Mhm.
lower level kids. What are some of the ways that you would engage students in the process of grammar, particularly as you were just saying before, this element of so,
Mhm.
what would be some ways that you perhaps talk about in your book to engage students in a fun not just for students but for teachers as well, a
Yes.
fun and engaging way to encompass and learn grammar.
I looked outside of school for what did people do in order to learn something else, just naturally. I love to refinish furniture with chalk paints and waxes, and there's no end to learning it. What do I do to get better and better at using these paints and waxes? I get curious about them. What color combinations might go together? I experiment on something different than the actual piece of furniture. I seek feedback from people to see what suggestions they might have. I seek out experts who know what they're doing more than I do so they can recommend some things for me. I then experiment and play until I make decisions. I reflect on how did this go? What might I do differently or the same the next time I paint a piece of furniture? And so then I thought to myself, what is it of that kind of learning that I authentically put myself into that's missing from grammar instruction? Curiosity has not traditionally been tapped as a place to start with grammar instruction. Reflection, experimentation, hypothesizing, seeking experts, having feedback, like all of that has been missing from grammar instruction. It's been present in other types of learning, but not in grammar. My approach is to have multiple entry points to teach grammar in a unit of study and related concepts in that unit with multiple entry points. Trust the process that over, say, 6 weeks with 10 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week. I'm just going to talk sentences right now, that we accumulate grammar know how like a snowball across that time. So instead, have these multiple entry points frequently for little snippets of time over time. And that is the difference.
So then, if I'm hearing you correctly, let's take sentences as an example. And the book that you wrote, Patty, is K-8, correct?
Yeah.
So let's say I'm a sixth grade English teacher. How do I fit this unit on sentences into my already existing curriculum? And then what does that come after in terms of grammar? And when do I do that? Could you
Mhm.
walk us through a
Mhm.
little bit of the curriculum scope and sequencing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, starting with sentences, as you said, I believe that's important in every grade level to start with simple, compound, and complex sentences. For second grade, it's usually simple and compound, but then they get curious about when can I use the word because? That can move us into at least introducing, but not mastering complex sentences, because that's not usually a second grade standard. And then in seventh grade, we add one more type of sentence, which is a compound complex sentence. So if we are repeating the sentence study up through the grade levels with a little more complexity, that's where I like to start. I have two kind of approaches here. One, those 10 minutes that we have, that it's one type of entry point. So it might be look at the two categories that I've already identified as simple and compound sentences. Talk to your partner, see what you think is the same and different about them. Come up with some theories, come up with some ideas. It's actually easier for kids to fall into that rhythm than it is for teachers because we were taught in teacher school that we have an objective and we master that objective by the time we finish a certain amount of time. But this approach, we have to let go of that belief. We have to say that it's like a snowball of learning. We start to accumulate some knowledge with every exposure or entry point, we build a little bit more. So that stands alone, almost like a word study might. And it's not to say it's isolation because we are using words and playing with words. And I'd love to talk about some of the manipulatives that I have and how we can play with grammar a little bit later. But just knowing that we're not looking for mastery every time, we're looking for growth over time. I have lots of different ways of assessing that growth.
We're going to talk about both those manipulatives and assessment. If I understand you correctly, you've mentioned almost like spiraling, like starting in the lower grades with simple sentence structures, moving into more complex, and then moving to
Compound complex is usually a 7th grade standard.
exactly. So, what are the other elements of grammar that you think should be hit along the way of 2-8?
So that's really indicated by whatever state standards there are. Grammar is really, there's almost like 3 categories of grammar. There's spoken grammar, which changes from community to community, household to household, school to school, whatever it might be. There's this use of grammar that what we say now, our own little lingo. And then there's book grammar, where authors are using grammar stylistically, not sticking to standard grammar. What I mean by standard grammar are the grammar standards, the language standards.
Right.
Authors know how to make meaning on the page because they know grammar and decide when to use it accurately, like standard grammar, and when not to. It acts like a painter's paintbrush. So, grammar in book grammar is artfully composed, designed by that author. But it's like Picasso. Picasso was a fine artist until he went all Picasso on us. Knowing standard grammar and that there's no superior type of grammar, they influence each other very much. There's more influence on conversational grammar than there is the other way around, standard grammar onto conversational grammar. And so when we think about having those 3 buckets, knowing that the grammar standards are driving what it is that we are expected to teach, but also reteach in different years. And I do have a scope and sequence for grades 2 through 8 that I recommend. But one thing that stays solid is the first unit is a sentence unit.
Nice. And that's a sentence unit in every year.
Yeah, starting in 2nd grade and moving up through 8th, and I would prefer that it went all the way to 12.
From K to probably university, even though the focus is
Mhm.
mostly K-12. So let's say I'm a high school teacher. Let's say I'm a science teacher. Let's say I'm not even the ELA teacher,
Mhm.
focused on my science. Let's say I'm the history teacher. Should I worry about grammar? And what would that look like in my class if I'm a science teacher?
The first easiest one is when you're having kids write as a product, like something to hand in, a lab report, an informational piece, whatever it might be, pick 1 or 2 areas of grammar that you're going to focus on. Because a content area teacher is meant to teach content. And we can support grammar by prioritizing some of the things that we'll be looking for when we give feedback in that. Another way, which has been so much fun for me to create, is post production. I use grammar manipulatives to teach content. For example, I call it Presto Changeo, where we're taking simple sentences and I have listed a bunch of content specific sentences. Let's say the solar system. I've got all simple sentences about the solar system. Then I teach how to create a compound sentence. And then kids together manipulate the sentences, the comma, and the conjunctions to create compound sentences, but they're specifically written to content. And because of that, they're learning grammar as a byproduct and as a structure of the experience. They're repeatedly saying to each other the content we want them to know. When it doesn't make sense, we're like, okay, those are two simple sentences that really don't go together. We wouldn't put them together because that's not accurate. But we could put these two sentences together or switch the order of them. It's using grammar as the vehicle for prioritizing content with the wonderful byproduct of also reinforcing grammar.
And what I like about that, Patty, is I like a lot about that. I like the creativity of that. And I like the fact that students actually have to justify why they're combining those simple sentences the way they are. And that relates to the content we're talking about. Reading a small passage and then they're answering questions one by one. That is so boring. This is a way that you could be doing that. Here are the simple sentences related to this passage we just read, let's say on the solar system. First, you're going to put your simple sentences together to make compound sentences. And then we're actually going to answer them. And then you could almost be getting into a dialogue with your students around, do you agree with Patty? Not just how she formed the question and the grammar, but then even the answer, which gets to the content. So I really love how you're referencing that grammar is living and it's built into what you are teaching. It's not separate. Same thing with spelling, Patty. One thing that to me is like nails on a chalkboard is when I go into a classroom and teachers start saying, all right, here is the word list for the week, the spelling list for the week, rather than what I think is a great way to do it and also interesting. All right, let's take these 3 words from this unit and you tell me how these 3 words are related and what are some synonyms, what are some examples and non-examples, classic Freyer model. But again, integrating spelling into the content learning. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. Yes. It's just creating opportunities that students are learning and reinforcing multiple skills and knowledge all at the same time.
What are some of the other fun activities you like doing?
Oh gosh, I have so many.
Give us about 3 or 4. So,
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I want to say about this is if you go to my website, there's a free download that has templates for this already created if you wanted to use it in the content area. One of my favorites is because what happens in classrooms when this is used in partnerships is just awesome. It's almost like magic. We take a sentence or a few sentences, put them in very large font, and then cut out each word and each piece of punctuation, put them in a baggie or envelope, and then ask partners, grammar out loud. I think that's very important. Ask partners to write sentences from that sentence. We can reuse the words as much as we want to. It's not once you use the word, you can't use it again. You can use it as many times as you would like in the time period we have. But sentences from a sentence is a fan favorite. It's collaborative, it is playful. The difference between play and games, which there's many differences, but to me, games have a winner and a loser. Play has an unpredictable outcome. And when we have winners or losers with games and grammar, we're creating this, we know who doesn't understand it, and that's like shame and embarrassment around it. I did this just recently with a group of educators at NCTE, and I heard so much laughter and so many things like, no, you can't say it like that, discussing the grammar concepts with such enjoyment that I stopped us and I said, when was the last time you laughed this hard when you were working with grammar? It was them cracking themselves up with their attempts at things, their silly phrasing, or just so many possibilities that can be created from that. Now, that can be done in an ELA block, that can be done using content. You don't need slides, you don't need bling, you just need some really juicy sentences cut them out, and the kids can help us do that and create some sentences. As the facilitator of this, if I see something wrong, I don't necessarily correct it right away. I'll give them a little challenge. I'll say, "This is almost a sentence. You're just missing one thing." There's usually a partner who's like, "I told you."
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
but if I do need to correct because they can't figure it out, I ask them to create a similar sentence using that concept. So super simple, highly accessible, fully collaborative, so engaging.
And the other thing I like about that, Patty, is you can be doing that activity in multiple years.
Mhm.
The activity doesn't change.
Right.
The grammar you're using changes and is grade
Yes.
appropriate. But you could do that strategy all the way from grade two
Mm.
up through university. You were using that at a conference with adults, with
Mhm.
teachers. I like the universality of it. You also mentioned something that I want to explore a little bit when you were talking about this being an equitable, non-judging way of
Mhm.
presenting grammar where the emphasis is on fun and not who knows it and who doesn't know it.
Mm.
That might be your students who are struggling readers. That might be your multilingual learners, depending
Mhm.
on what level of proficiency they have in
Mhm.
English. Can you give teachers any advice on how to scaffold these fun activities so they are inclusive of everyone in the class, regardless of their academic readiness level?
Yes. I like to have long-term partnerships or trios where we are co-creating, co-building grammar know-how. And having somebody who is a little bit more new to English with 2 others that are native speakers, that kind of collaboration, because it's low stakes, there's no grade attached, there's no quiz afterwards, it's truly play. That is really what can build that inclusivity because everybody can contribute to it. Now write your own sentences. The scaffold that's in there that I've created by giving words already, that's so beneficial for those who might struggle. When there are words that kids might not understand, I just define them. We're working on grammar. Tear streaked, because I use a sentence that has that in there, means the streaks that the tears leave on your face when you're crying. Before we get to the play, I like to start with inquiry, simple and compound sentences, and theorizing the differences. Then I might do an explicit teaching day, how I can tell what a simple sentence is, or how I can take two simple sentences and create a compound sentence. And then there's a day of play, or maybe 2 days of play, so that there's the opportunity to approximate, to get feedback, to be challenged, to hear from peers, to talk it through. It's scaffolded also in the progression of the lessons. And then again, we're not expecting mastery. Following that, I really like to have 10 minutes another day of reflection. What have you learned so far? What are you curious about? What are you wondering about? I'm thinking of the in class support fourth grade that piloted this work for us. And they had studied simple and complex sentences. They were like, we know that there's a comma in these different sentences. Can you put three simple sentences together? That would often come up. Or I'd rather use the word because. How come I can't use that here? I'm like, oh, because that's a compound sentence, and because is one of those words that makes a complex sentence. So those wonderings drive kids to be even more curious about how grammar works. And that curiosity is fuel. And so all of those are intrinsically scaffolded.
I love that. Now, Patty, we were talking before about assessment. So I'd
Mhm.
like to circle back to that. I'm thinking about, okay, so it's not about mastery. One wondering I have is, okay, so if it's not about mastery, what is the goal? And how do I
Mhm.
measure whether or not students are successful at that goal. And number two, does a student's dialect or cultural background, how does that fit into assessment? So, for example, if I'm teaching the solar system, what is proficiency in your model with the grammar? And again, how do I account for different words in different cultures? You even mentioned that you have micro words in your own family, right? How do we honor that and not penalize people for that?
I like to think of assessment in basically 2 categories, even though there's 3: assessment of learning and assessment for learning. And throughout a grammar study unit, I am mostly using assessment for learning. I'm looking at what kids are putting in their grammar notebooks. I'm listening into their conversations. I even have an example of my notes that I keep as I'm listening. It's a simple grid so I can track growth over time. One of my favorite things to do is to start with a pre assessment and then revisit it in the post assessment. For a sentence unit, I might have 4 sentences written and ask kids to write everything they know about those sentences in the pre assessment. Teachers often ask me, why do the pre assessment if it's clear they don't know much? Because when we get to the end of grammar study, like a grammar unit, we go back to the pre assessment. Kids write down what they know now. And that is huge for kids to see. And gosh, so satisfying for teachers. It's look at the growth. First of all, we want to realize that grammar learning doesn't ever really have an end. It's something that we are growing in. If we could equate it to like a painter with
Mhm.
a paintbrush, are they ever going to stop learning different techniques or combinations of techniques with their brushstrokes? There really isn't an end to that learning, that creativity. And that's how I think of grammar too. In a grammar study, we get to the point where we have grown enough to begin to expect or try some of these things in our own writing. Grammar for learning, and then thinking about transfer. Grammar transfer happens a little bit in grammar study, but let's say co-create a tool that can be used when we write, when we want to design 3 different types of sentences. In the editing process, we use the tool that we created from grammar study unit 1, and that shows up in editing. In the next writing piece, that same concept shows up in revising, where the next unit of grammar study shows up in editing. We're cycling through, if that makes sense. There's a chart in the book that would give a visual for that, but we're cycling through the usage of grammar throughout the writing, and ideally giving these same tools to a teacher if you're departmentalized for them to also use as kids are working on their content area writing.
Do you have an example of when students use cultural language
Mm.
and how you still assess grammar learning?
Yes. So when it comes to using cultural language, first of all, I want them to. And second, I also want them to, over time, this really depends on the grade level and their understanding of their audience when they write, when we might use more culturally specific language and when we would use more standard specific language. Kids are learning, if they're learning English, there's going to be stretched language in there. There's going to be a combination of native language to new language. And I want to see that those are attempts at trying to use it. If it's assessment for learning, I look at how they're stretching language and think about what could be a next step in this stretching of language. Let's say they are using verbs that are native to their language, but the nouns they know in a new language. I'll note that's a strength using the nouns, and conjugating the verbs is a tricky part. So I know that I'll need to work on that. We can give them that information. The ENL or MLL teacher can also like team up with us for that. So I want to respect native language and also show the times where writing is the last phase of language acquisition. We know kids will go through those phases, but that final phase, I will expect more standard grammar when the audience is one for that.
It's interesting you mentioned that there's a time when you would expect standard language. As we're talking about this, I'm thinking, to your point about grammar for learning, if the goal is to use grammar and use language to, again, learn about the solar system, if they're having fun, they are learning grammar, even if there's still mistakes, or it's culturally specific grammar because the point is the solar system. Whereas, let's say part of the objective is to give a presentation on the solar system. Again, it would matter as to who your audience is. If your audience is your community, if that is still communicated in a way where your audience understands, I would think culturally relevant grammar is acceptable, even if it's not standard English grammar.
Yes.
Let's say you have a mixed audience that doesn't come from that culture, then yes, we want to teach our students when to use cultural, when we want to use standard English. It's almost the way that you would speak to your mother is not the way you would speak to your
Yeah.
friends.
One of the most important parts of writing well is considering who your audience is. We're choosing the best way to communicate with them so that what we're trying to say will be heard as clearly as possible from the grammatical choices that we make.
Indeed. And then I'm also thinking it's also depends on not only who the audience is if you're giving a presentation, but also who you're writing for and what you're writing about. You're writing about a certain community. You almost want to use that cultural language to be authentic and representational of that community. That's what makes the writing come alive.
If our audience is someone who isn't as familiar with our culture, but we want to share some grammar, some words from our culture that might be new, we teach when to explain it. Think about your audience. I have a frope that my son used to say when he was little. No, I have a frope. So in my culture, I might say, or something we say is, and it might be explained in this way.
So now you've done a lot of work in schools, helping schools and school communities really make grammar come alive. To really engage both students and teachers in grammar. What are some examples? What has really made you get up on some mornings and go, yes? Or maybe not get up, but maybe after you've been at a school and it was a really great day and you rest your head on that pillow. What were some of those moments in the work that you did with schools that made you sleep well on those nights? Could you take us through
Yes.
some of your success stories? Give us one, your
Okay.
best moment.
Can I give you a student best moment and a teacher
Okay.
best moment? So, a student best moment, there's many of them. It's magical to watch how kids engage in this way. If I had to choose one, it would be when I went into a seventh grade classroom to demo for seventh grade teachers a series of grammar lessons that would be taught over time. And I introduced to the kids and said, this is what I'm doing. I have my own way of teaching grammar, and that's how I'm going to teach you today. When I was leaving, a seventh grade boy just shouted out to me at the end, "That's so much better than the old way." What's a better endorsement than a seventh grade boy saying how much better that grammar instruction is?
Exactly.
My favorite teacher response comes from that in class support that I was talking about earlier. The special ed teacher who was pairing with the general ed teacher who had agreed to pilot a unit for me felt very skeptical at the beginning and was like, this will work for the general ed population, but I really doubt this is going to be something that works for the kids that she's paying the most attention to. She had a complete turnaround in her thinking by the end of just one unit. She said that she saw so much growth in students that struggle and not only in their skills, but their engagement with this type of approach. They were doing it with a document that I shared with them to get that response that it not only meets kids where they are, but also creates deep engagement with a subject that usually has not been engaging.
And now, Patty, we've talked about the excitement that students and teachers can have teaching grammar in this new way. If you had to give advice, so let's say we have a listener out there who's, I'm going to try this tomorrow. What advice would you give them in terms of what to look out for, how to stay the course? What have we not talked about that it's really important for people who are going to go back to their school tomorrow and implement this that they know?
Yes. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I want to underscore it that within each grammar experience, number one, they're varied grammar experiences. Number two, we are not looking for mastery in that amount of time. Number three, please don't make anything extra. We don't need blingy slides. We don't need extra time spent. We just need the materials like chart paper, scissors to cut things out, a resource to study and then hypothesize from. The leaner it is, the less distractions there are from the actual experience, the deeper the learning will be.
So, Patty, where can people find out more about you and this amazing work you're doing?
I have a website that's chock full of good stuff, including a couple of free downloads about grammar, but also about writing feedback. And my website is pattymcgee.org. Make sure you spell Patty with a Y, because if you spell Patty with an I, you're going to get that famous skateboarder from the 60s. And that's not me.
Can they find you on LinkedIn as well?
Just searching my name on LinkedIn, Patty McGee. Also, I'm on Instagram, and my handle there is at PMG McGee.
And let's give props to your co-author. Do you know where folks
Tim.
could reach out to Tim?
I should put his email on my website. He's an assistant superintendent of a nearby district, and his exposure isn't nearly as much as mine because his role is different. I can put his email on my website, and if you just want to shoot me a message through my website, I can also share Tim's information.
Great. And I'll also see if he's on LinkedIn and put his information in the show notes too. Although you were the star tonight. Just to give him props as your co-writer.
If I could say one thing about him as a co-writer,
Please.
he created this whole section called the Grammar Refresher. Everything you need to know in plain language about language. And he also created videos of him teaching these things. He got a dry erase board for his basement, and his boys, who were like 8th grade and younger, took videos of him.
Patty, thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.